Yesterday, we looked at the conditions of civil surrender and civil war which have been developing in Portland, Oregon over the last 80 days. The mayor and the district attorney have surrendered the city, and that's no exaggeration. They've surrendered it to criminal anarchists and have prohibited the police from acting. The mayor and the DA have stopped the police from preventing violence and then have also stopped them from maintaining the peace, which they really want to do. Now, President Trump has offered federal help, but it has been rejected, very visibly rejected. He has encouraged his supporters in Portland to refrain from confronting criminal agitators and activists and provocateurs and killers and to leave the confrontation to the police. But how's it going to happen if the police have stood down and have been forced to stand down? The president has also said he will not denounce armed citizens who defend property if the police are forced to stand down by magistrates like the mayor and the DA. And the president has categorized the ones in Portland, Oregon as negligent fools. Portland is not the only city where police have been prohibited from doing their work. The anarchy is getting worse all over the country. Riots have broken out in some 2,000 American cities now. And in Portland, citizens are now at risk, and I'm sure you all have seen this in the news. They're at risk of death from arson, knifings, and gunfire, and have not known how to respond. Destructive counter-riots are not the answer. People can't just go out in the streets and do this. They've tried to experiment with this. It is no answer. Playing skirmish with rioters is no answer. Running into the street with bear spray and paintball guns only makes the demonstrators more certain that there is an irredeemable enemy out there which must be destroyed in a more serious form of warfare. The easy targets, of course, for them are citizens who are alone and vulnerable, stragglers, people who are by themselves. And this week, the mobs rejoiced that Aaron Danielson, that we talked about yesterday, was killed by one of their own in an act of murder, and it was likened to taking out the trash by the celebrants. Danielson was damned and labeled as a fascist, which makes him and those like him fair game for a kind of homicide the left claims is totally justifiable. This is nothing more than genocide in the name of social justice. This is genocide being carried out by the lawless. And we've seen it all through the 20th century, and now it's come to the United States, and we're seeing it in at least 2,000 cities. So what can law-abiding citizens do when their cities become war zones like these? When magistrates refuse to study and enforce the law and surrender their jurisdictions to militant criminals, citizens must resist to preserve their lives and property. But how can they do that? Is all-out civil war the only answer? And yesterday I offered 3 out of 4 alternative solutions to violent warfare. And now I want to explore number 4. And here's where I need you to really focus in and be creative and resourceful. Number 4 is to define the term local militia using constitutional, legal, and historic language. Okay, because this term has been defined by enemy magistrates, by an enemy media that doesn't like the concept, and so they've changed the word into a pejorative over about the last 40 years. And now I'm asking you to join me in redefining it. And then I'm asking you to do something that's even a lot harder, to actually form local units, local militia units, in broad daylight with the full knowledge of your local sheriff, your governor, the FBI, and any other relevant law enforcement agency. Your legal obligation to do this, it's just not an option. You have an obligation to do this. It's in 10 U.S. Code Section 246. Now, there is no need to sneak around on this fully constitutional institution and just try to do it in the shadows, try to do it in the dark. You don't need to do that. The M word is not a dirty word, though it is a flag word on social media, internet outlets, because it has been so misdefined. And no one should let me just say, no one should be allowed to twist this word, this historic and constitutional meaning of this word. It's not the media, not the rednecks, nobody. Of course, insurgents in the media use words like ammunition, to do damage and destruction. And, and I have to admit, unstable rednecks, they can use .223 cartridges for the same kind of ammo to do some other kind of damage. And both are just equally dangerous. If we destroy the meaning of this word, we destroy the possibility of peace and security. The true lawful M institution, the M word, the institution, is referred to 6 times in the Constitution and is listed numerous times in the U.S. Code. And I'll call militia for this message the M unit, and you will understand why. For algorithm reasons, I don't want to populate my message so much with that word that it is flagged. I want to be able to continue communicating these things, and it's difficult when we can't even use the real language that we've been given and the real laws that we've been given and the real truth that we've been given. And so I'm doing the very best I can with this, and I'm asking you to join me in making this, taking this word, out of the dustbin of history and where it's been thrown unceremoniously by the media, and pull it back up and put it back where it belongs. This historic word has been turned to something very ugly by the media for a very long time. Even the FBI has embraced media fear-mongering and is following the slang of pop media rather than following written law. Now, of course, and we do admit, I know this and you know this, there are groups of unstable, angry citizens who go out there and they get all worked up, they go out and buy guns, they go out and buy ammunition, and they form themselves into little clubs, gun clubs, or almost like neighborhood watch kind of groups, and they carry chips on their shoulders. And they could feasibly do something that's really stupid, something that's criminal. And sometimes these groups like to roam around looking for something foolish to do with all that firepower. They feel strong, they feel arrogant, they feel like they're going to solve things with their guns. And I call immature gangs like this boog boys. They are not representations of the historic M unit. And yes, the media loves to call them that and attach that word to them and say, look how irresponsible they are. This is what the word really means. Look how criminal they are. Look how reckless they are. Look how arrogant they are. Look how immature they are. That's exactly what this word means, and they love to be able to attach it to people like them. And that's not who you are, and that's what I don't want you to become. Let me define now what this word meant for centuries, and all through the 17th century and the 18th century in the Americas and the American colonies, up until the writing of our Constitution, and then well into the 20th century. The local lawful militia is a very well-trained, disciplined group of local citizens, men aged 17 to 45, and that's what the American law says. All men, all citizens, all aged 17 through 45, who own military-grade weapons and serve under local leaders who answer ultimately to the governor of their state. Now, it's a little bit different in different states. In my state, that's who we answer to here. It's not the National Guard. It is not the formal, quote, organized militia, end quote. The small local units are decentralized and fully accountable to elected authority in their area. They exist for a specific purpose, to defend local populations from insurrection and riot and invasion and, of course, political tyranny when that springs up. That's why we have these units. That's why we've had them all through the centuries. And this is one reason that crooked politicians really hate them and want to destroy them and discredit them. And these units have the power. They can band together with other ones and do a mighty work in defending an entire region from invasion, if they need to. They have the power, but of course locally, to force crooked politicians to straighten up. And this is why dishonest politicians not only hate these units, they hate the Second Amendment as well, because it is really more of a militia amendment than a firearm amendment. Just read it. Just look at it. See what it says. You know, it's necessary to have these militias and a well-regulated militia. And that's for that reason. That's why the right to keep and bear arms, ARMS, cannot be infringed. And this amendment is still in the Constitution. And the Constitution is still binding on all of us and on the politicians who bear allegiance to it and swear allegiance to it. And I'd like to thank right now Google and the Alphabet Corporation for keeping the U.S. Constitution on their platforms within easy reach of people all over America and all over the world. Thank you for doing that. And within that platform, you can do research on the M word and find out what it has meant historically. It's an old word, but the concept is perpetual and has never been more pertinent to chaos and anarchy than it is right now in 2020 America, especially if local police and units are defunded, and if Antifa assassins roam the streets looking for those who refuse to join them in the mob. Now take a look at the following example, and please do share this video with people you know who want a peaceful solution to criminal rioting, at least as peaceful as possible. Americans have been down this road before, and I'm talking about having chaos in the streets, having rioting and looting in the streets and arson in the streets. We've had murderous thugs in our streets, and we were targeted at one point for genocide in the 1770s when we faced an overpowering force of German mercenaries and British stormtroopers who were coming after us. We wouldn't heal. We wanted to be independent. We wrote a Declaration of Independence. They were not going to have it. And we knew war was on the horizon prior to that, when we were bullied on our own streets by these soldiers who were acting like thugs. We were told we were rebels. And when it was, in fact, it was them who were. It was the other side, which was rebelling against established law and justice. And here's what happened. What was going on at that time? They were carrying on a tradition. The American men in the colonies were carrying forward this tradition. Each American man from the approximate ages of age 13 to 75 acquired and knew how to use a military class rifle and the ammunition for it. Men and boys assembled themselves into decentralized defensive fighting units. And often these were organized around church parishes because they were, they were geographically centered. They were centered around what the men believed, their theology, and their affections in the area, and their affections for one another. They certainly weren't going to turn tail and run when they had, cousins and brothers and fathers and sons fighting together. They trained regularly under a local commander elected by the men of the unit. They trained to a high standard of weapon discipline. They trained for speed. They trained for accuracy. And they also trained for communication, especially communication in the noise of battle. And they had a hierarchy of succession in the event of the death of their commanders. And they didn't go out looking for trouble. Once they were these crack units, they waited to be called on by their community leaders or the commander-in-chief. And there was a hierarchy of authority all the time for these units. They were not little, private armies for some local commander who came up with the idea of one. There's, in my local area here where I live, there was one of these units, one militia unit, which existed at the time, was elected Davy Crockett to be their commander, to be their colonel. And he didn't just use this as his own little private army. They were too busy building a nation, building the state of Tennessee. They didn't have time to run around and play soldier, but they had assembled themselves, and they knew each other. They knew how to communicate, and they knew how to be a well-regulated unit during times of battle. And a couple of times they did have to band together and take care of terrorists, and they were very good at it. But they would go out and do that, and then they would come back home. They rallied with other similar decentralized units if the problem was bigger than just in one particular area. Now, none of these units and none of their commanders were ever criminal or vigilantes. They were part of the lawfully organized and well-regulated Home Guard. And when hot fighting broke out, finally, during the War of Independence, now we had been really patient, appealing to the king, appealing to Parliament, time and time again. But finally, fighting did break out. And the commander-in-chief, George Washington, who didn't want to fight, didn't want to go to war again, but he agreed to be the commander-in-chief. During the war, he found these local units, which were called militias back then, because that was the proper term for them. He found them to be much better trained than the infantry in his own army. And Dr. Philip Kaiser writes, historians credit local units with saving Washington's bacon over and over again. Their very decentralization was an asset in many ways. They knew the local country better than anyone else and were able to outmaneuver the British and give good advice to Washington. Because of their smaller numbers and their nimbleness, they were able to harass the enemy continually and then suddenly disappear. In fact, in some parts of the country, the unaffiliated units did more battle than Washington's army did. And that's how it can be. That's how it should be. And by the way, they did outperform even the very best trained units in the British military. And we know that because we kept stats. Thomas Jefferson kept a lot of the stats on how the battles went, how many rounds were fired, how accurate were the rounds, how many people were killed, how many were wounded. And our boys in these units, including very young ones, could outshoot the enemy and did outshoot the enemy. And that's one of the reasons that we may have won. Now, they were quick to credit, of course, the providential kindness of God Almighty, the God of battles, and not their skill on the battlefield. And I don't want to take that away from them and their faith. Now, how many Americans today, right now, in 2020, are part of a mature and legal and responsible and trained and restrained unit like one of these? How many? How many American governors know that these units are totally available to help them and protect his or her state? Well, we just don't have those units, that are formal and correct and properly formed and legal and lawful and truly constitutional and accountable to the proper authorities. We just don't have them. We do have these units that are running around arrogantly that are not accountable. And of course, like I said, the media is really quick to want to attach a pejorative to them and to then continue to discredit this term by affiliating that word with some really irresponsible jerks who have guns. That's not what we're talking about here. And I don't want you to be part of units like that. I don't want you to form units like that. I don't want you to join units like that. Take some initiative to create one that is truly constitutional and lawful. Get with your sheriff. Talk to him about how you might do that. I've recently been studying the arrangements being made by the sheriff of Clay County down in Florida. And he is getting ready for chaos to be imported into his county from outside, because he knows that's how it's being worked. It's being funded by organizers far away from his county, and then they will bus people in to riot and burn and to terrorize the population. And he's ready for all his deputies to be able to address the situation and be deployed and go right to it and begin the arrests and stop that before it gets out of hand. And he's also ready to deputize every single gun owner who is a law-abiding gun owner in his county. That's probably most of the men down there. And they will be readily available to work together and I hope that there are little local units around who have trained together, who can operate together and respond together and carry out objectives together and restore the peace really, really fast. So what are you doing in your county to get to know your neighbors and to find out how you could do this? You could form one of these units in the light, not in the darkness, not in the shadows, but be totally upfront about it. And then restore the meaning of what it means to be a well-regulated militia, which means really in good shape to be able to do what you need to do. Very disciplined and orderly. What are you doing about that? Do you own the equipment that you need to own? That is, military spec. And do you have armor? And do you have communication? Do you have radios? Do you have all the things that you might need to be able to use in a dangerous, warlike situation? Because it's becoming more and more like a war zone in these counties all over the country. What are you doing to change that? Here's the consistent principle that was carefully formed and tried and tested and proven and then preserved. Going way back to about 1000 AD, even before, from the time of Alfred the Great in the UK to the American founding. And here I'll put it up on the screen. All men have the duty and responsibility to keep arms, to train with their arms. And let me give you the definition of arms that goes back that far. It's offensive weapons, and of course the weapons changed a little bit more, over all the centuries. From bows to spears and arrows and swords, and so it was offensive weaponry, and then defensive armor for your person. You needed both, and that's the definition of arms. Arms was both offensive weapons and defensive protection for your body, like armor. And so you had a responsibility to own those. And I'm going to do another video that gets back into this history and traces it to show just how serious people were. If they wanted to have a civilized city or county, they had to work really hard at this. And if a nation or a kingdom wanted to preserve itself, the king knew that he needed to have citizenry that was really good at this. And many of the kings made it a requirement. And if men were lazy about putting together their weaponry and their armor, they could be fined, and they could have some of their possessions taken away from them, confiscated from them, and some of them could even suffer harm to their limbs if they wouldn't do what they were supposed to do to acquire these weapons and then train with them. And so this is the principle. You train with your arms, and then you train with your neighbors, and to use those weapons lawfully to protect the community. And why? From what? From foreign invaders, because that would happen. Every few years or so that would happen. And a prosperous, peaceful community would need to be trained for war, periodic war, if there were invasions. They weren't going out looking for, well, my ancestors did. We were Vikings. We were horrible. We had a very inferior civilization. We would rape and pillage to get the food that we needed and the women that we needed. And that was wrong. That was morally wrong. In a more orderly, moral society, they did things differently. They loved peace. They loved the free market economies that they were building up in their own region. They were developing every natural resource that they had in their regions, and they stayed home. But if people like the Vikings would come in, they were ready with people with arms and armor to band together and be able to fight together against an aggressive enemy and defeat him. And so they prepared for this, to protect their community from foreign invaders or domestic enemies like ambitious politicians. And of course, they could crop up too from time to time, or destructive revolutionaries. And that can happen from time to time in history. And so, where are we today in 2020? The chief executive officers in America, that would be 51 people, the President of the United States, and the governors of all 50 states. They're the chief executives. They need to use every available law, and citizens, they need to use the citizens too to fulfill their duty to stop every act of insurrection. And they have all the laws they need. We don't need to put together any more laws for them to be able to do this. They have all the laws they need in the Insurrection Act and in the U.S. Code. But do they have the dependable citizens that they need to be able to do this? That's where you come in. Are you dependable? Are you a good citizen? Can your community depend on you? So you need to talk to your neighbors. You need to talk to your sheriff. You need to share these videos with them and make a plan together on all 4 solutions that I've suggested and see how many people will join you in the peaceful remedies that I've suggested. That's what we're trying to do. So send me, please, questions and comments. We need to work on this together. Maybe you've got a list of 6 solutions that are far better. Can we share these together? Communicate with me. Send me your questions and your comments and your ideas to questions@jeffreybotkin.com. Let's work on this together. In the meantime, please share these videos around so that others can be thinking about these solutions and other ones and how to work within their communities to make these things a reality. Thank you.